Welcome to the First Citizens Wealth Management Money Matters series. My name is Tammy Harrison, and during this time, I'd like to review information in the CARES Act, specifically as it relates to IRAs. But first, please take a moment to review our disclosure. So the CARES Act is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act and was signed into law on March the 27th of 2020. It was meant to help families and businesses manage the financial uncertainty that we all have experienced with COVID-19. One of the provisions of the Secure Act expanded the Department of Labor's unemployment insurance program so it could provide additional benefits to individuals who have lost their jobs during these uncertain times. The CARES Act also paved the way for stimulus checks to be issued, and it also provided some additional funding for health care. A large part of the CARES Act was the creation of the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided funds through either a loan or grant so employers could keep and pay their existing workforce. And of course, the CARES Act made some significant changes to individual retirement accounts. One of those changes is the waiving of RMDs for 2020. So if you have an IRA with the requirement to take a minimum distribution each year, or RMD, that distribution for 2020 is now waived. So as a reminder, if you were over 70 and a half prior to January the 1st, 2020, the IRS required that you start taking distributions from your traditional IRA, your SEP or simple IRA, or even your inherited traditional or inherited Roth IRA. Retirement plans such as a 401k, 403b, or 457b also would have an RMD requirement, so those are waived as well for 2020. I would like to mention one unique situation, and that is the RMD requirement if 2020 is a year of death for the IRA owner. So if the IRA owner passed away in 2020 and they didn't take their RMD, or maybe they only took a portion of that RMD, well, because the CARES Act waived RMDs for 2020, the beneficiary of that IRA will not need to finish taking or take the decedent's RMD for that year. It is also important to note that Roth IRAs do not have an RMD requirement. And if you're taking a 72T payment using the RMD calculation method to determine your distribution amount, this distribution is not waived. A 72T payment does not fall under the definition of an RMD, even if that was the method used for calculation purposes. Now, I've received a lot of questions regarding relief the IRS provided regarding RMDs that have been given earlier this year and just recently. There is some great news. The IRS is now allowing individuals that may have taken their RMD earlier in the year to actually roll that distribution back into their IRAs as long as that rollover is completed by August the 31st of 2020. It's important to point out that the IRS has specifically waived the rule that states only one rollover every 12 months is allowed. With the waiving of this rule, it allows anyone who is receiving a recurring distribution that represented their RMD to aggregate those payments together and roll them back into the same IRA. If you've already completed one rollover and still have a balance of your RMD to roll back, you now can complete another rollover of those RMD funds. However, it is important to note one caveat regarding the return of these RMDs is that the IRS requires that these funds must be rolled back into the account they came from. And one last great point regarding the rollover relief given by the IRS is that RMDs received from an inherited traditional or inherited Roth IRA can now also be rolled back. Before this relief, they would not have been allowed to. Now, you may ask, well, what if I receive funds that are over and above my RMD amount? What options do I have with those? Well, the bad news is the IRS did not give relief for any amount over your RMD amount. So if you want to consider rolling those funds back, you still have to apply the regular rollover rules, such as only one rollover can be completed in a 12-month period of time, and that those funds you received would need to be rolled back within 60 days of receipt. So what if you haven't taken your RMD in 2020 yet? Can you still take one? Absolutely. Since RMDs are waived, the choice to take any distribution is yours to make, and it's completely voluntary. However, there are a few good reasons to still consider maybe taking a distribution in 2020. One of those reasons is that you may want to complete a QCD. A qualified charitable distribution is when you are over 70 and a half and you request the distribution be made payable directly to a charity, and that distribution amount is not over $100,000. By processing a QCD, that distribution would be excluded from your income. A few other reasons to consider taking a distribution from your IRA is if your tax rate is low right now, you of course would pay lower taxes on that distribution than maybe later when you may have a higher tax rate. If you take a distribution, of course, it will lower your IRA account balance, which would in turn lower the amount of any future RMDs. And then another great reason to take a voluntary distribution from your traditional IRA is to complete a conversion to a Roth IRA. So let's talk a little bit more about why you may want to consider a conversion from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA. As I previously mentioned, a big reason to complete a conversion now is that the taxability of that conversion would be lower. The second reason is any distributions going out of your IRA would reduce your market value. So when that RMD is calculated once again, which we do anticipate RMDs going back in place for 2021 as of right now, that RMD amount will be lower. Another reason to consider taking a distribution and using it for a conversion to a Roth would be if you already plan for the tax impact of a RMD distribution and you don't have to take that now, but those taxes are set aside to pay on it. Now you could just apply those budgeted tax dollars towards the conversion instead. It's important to remember that regulations dictate that the first dollars out of an IRA must represent the RMD. So in a normal year, you would have to take your RMD out first before you consider taking out any additional amounts to use for conversion. But since RMDs are waived for 2020, those first dollars out can now be applied straight away towards a conversion to a Roth. As we wrap up, here's a few things for you to consider. If you are in RMD status for 2020, consider rolling back any RMD you may have taken already. Or if you haven't taken your RMD, consider if a voluntary distribution could be used for a QCD, a Roth conversion, or even just to take a distribution to help your overall tax picture, either now or in the future. So I'd like to thank you for listening to the First Citizens Bank Money Matters series. If you're a client of First Citizens Wealth Management, please feel free to reach out to your relationship manager if you have any questions. If you are not a current client of First Citizens Wealth Management, we would love the opportunity to speak with you. So please contact us at www.firstcitizens.com.